Alright, in this video I'm going to show you how you can take and start sanding your pendant. First things we need to know are a little bit about sandpaper. So we use a variety of different types of sandpaper in the studio, and the way that you can tell the difference between them is on the back they all have numbers. Of course, to make it confusing, companies have lots of different things going on, but your number is usually in the hundreds, so here it's 220. If I turn this one over, I see 100. So the difference is the lower the number, the more coarse it is. So 100 is pretty coarse. You can feel the roughness. 220 is somewhere in between. And then if I go to this one, this is our finest sandpaper. It actually says 600 on it. So it actually doesn't even feel like sandpaper. It feels more smooth, and this would be a final round. So you typically want to start with your more coarse and work your way up. If you're doing something like working on the surface of the metal and there aren't big scratches, you might skip the most coarse and start with something in the middle. So I think what I'll do is I'll start with the surface, because that's something I talked about. So if I look at the surface here, I see some discoloration. I see a couple scratches, but for the most part it's pretty smooth. So I'm going to start with my 220 that I just talked about. This is something that's kind of in between. I'm going to place it down and put my piece of metal on top of it. Now, holding it to sand it can be kind of tricky. So you can take masking tape and you can make a little tape bracket. So I'm doing this with the sticky part out, and then I can put my fingers inside of it so it's sticky on the outside. Now, and my metal is kind of held in place by this, and I can do some sanding on the surface. Alright, so I just did a little bit. If you look, it looks a lot cleaner than it did. You can still see some places where I didn't get great attachment. They seem to be at the edges. So I might go and move my metal so I have more of a connection. Or more pressure in those areas. Sometimes if you do this with your middle of the road sandpaper, like the 220, you might see some other big scratches that don't seem to be leaving. If that's the case, that means they're deeper, and you might have to go back to the 100 sandpaper. Alright, so I feel pretty good about this side. I got most of it to be pretty similar. I'm not going to worry about the other side now, just to save time with you guys. But now I can move up to some finer sandpaper. So this is 400. And the point of this is to slowly get rid of any of the sanding marks that I got from the 220. So if I go to finer, I'll see less lines. It'll look even more smooth on the surface. And then eventually, when I see all of the lines going in the same direction with this, I might end with 220, or not 220, 600, and that should take away like all of your inconsistencies. So you start with the most coarse, the lowest level, work your way up to the highest level. Now for things like edges, okay, so I still have some bumps that I might want to work on. A lot of times it's easiest to start with something coarse, once again, if you have big bumps. And if you're going for really straight edges, you don't want to use a file, you can use sandpaper, and you can just hold it. So I'm holding it on its side, and I'm just kind of working my way through, and you can see how much it's taken away and how much you still have to go. In the same way, you would work your way up, starting with 100, and then you would work up to 220, 400, and keep going. So I can look at that edge I've been working on, and I see where it's made contact because it becomes shiny, and where there's still some areas where it's a little more dull. So that just tells me how much more I might have to do with the metal. Alright, I'm getting a lot closer to a straight edge. Okay, so at this point, it's a lot smoother. It's almost made full contact. So I'm going to move my way up to my 220 sandpaper. Okay, so it's a little more fine grain, and this I can work more on the details of it. Now, some people like a really, really sharp edge, meaning you have straight side, straight back. Some people like it more rounded. So if I want to round it, I can just hold it on an angle, and that should soften this edge right up. Okay, let's talk about sanding interior spaces. If you have a spot that's really difficult to get to, you can use something like 220 and actually make a strip Sometimes it's best, especially for the small spaces I have, to actually cut it so you have a really nice thin strip, and you can actually thread it through. This can work really well with your bench pin, and then you can even clamp it down, and you can work on threading on the inside or sanding on the inside. Just another way that you can kind of clean up your pendant and make it beautiful.